They mocked her the first week, called her soft when they saw her wiping away tears during drills. Too weak for this, they whispered behind her back. But she kept going, quietly, relentlessly. Then came the fall. A 220-pound instructor, twisted ankle, miles from base. The others hesitated. She didn't. She hoisted him over her shoulders, every step defying every insult they'd ever thrown at her. 3 miles later, she dropped to one knee, gasping, trembling, but unbroken. And as medics rushed in, the same men who once laughed now stood silent. Because the girl who cried just carried them all. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories that show how true strength isn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every single time, consider subscribing for more content that reveals the power hidden in moments of vulnerability. The autumn rain hammered the concrete courtyard of the Defense Intelligence Analysis Center when Private First Class Elena Rodriguez first walked through the gates of the most demanding intelligence training program in the United States military. At 0545 hours on a gray October morning in Virginia, the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the persistent drizzle into a miserable combination of cold and wet that seemed to penetrate through even the best military-issue rain gear. The sky hung low and threatening, promising a day that would test both equipment and personnel as they began what many considered the most challenging intelligence training program in the Western world. The Defense Intelligence Analysis Center, known throughout the intelligence community as the Farm, occupied a sprawling complex of nondescript buildings that could have been mistaken for a corporate headquarters or research facility from a distance. But behind the unremarkable exterior lay training facilities where the military's most promising intelligence analysts learned skills that would determine America's ability to identify and prevent threats to national security before they could materialize into attacks on American soil or interests abroad. The complex itself reflected the secretive nature of its mission. No signs identified the facility's purpose, no public roads provided direct access, and the entire perimeter was monitored by security systems that could detect and track any unauthorized approach from miles away. Inside the gates, buildings were connected by covered walkways that allowed personnel to move between facilities without being observed by satellite surveillance or other intelligence-gathering methods that enemy forces might employ. Rodriguez had arrived at the farm carrying academic credentials that would have guaranteed acceptance at any civilian graduate program in the country, along with personal motivation that went beyond simple career advancement. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University with dual degrees in international relations and Middle Eastern studies, demonstrating fluency in Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, and 3 additional languages that were considered critical to American security interests in an increasingly complex global environment. Her undergraduate thesis on terrorist recruitment patterns and radicalization processes had been published in academic journals and cited by policymakers throughout the government, including senior officials at the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Council. The research had involved extensive analysis of captured communications, intercepted propaganda materials, and psychological profiles of individuals who'd been recruited by terrorist organizations operating in multiple countries and cultural contexts. But academic achievement, no matter how impressive, was only the beginning of what the farm demanded from its students. The 16-week Advanced Intelligence Analysis program was designed to identify individuals who could process complex information under extreme pressure, make life-and-death assessments based on incomplete and often contradictory data, and maintain psychological stability while confronting evidence of humanity's capacity for violence, destruction, and calculated cruelty directed at innocent civilian populations. The program accepted fewer than 60 candidates annually from thousands of applications submitted by military personnel, civilian analysts, recent graduates from the nation's most prestigious universities, and experienced professionals seeking to transition into intelligence work. Those selected represented the intellectual elite of their generation, individuals whose analytical capabilities, psychological profiles, and background investigations suggested they could handle responsibilities that affected national security at the highest levels of government decision-making. The selection process itself was rigorous beyond anything Rodriguez had previously experienced. Candidates underwent extensive psychological evaluation, comprehensive background investigations that examined every aspect of their personal and professional lives, polygraph examinations that tested their honesty and emotional stability, and academic assessments that evaluated their ability to process information under time constraints that simulated operational conditions. But intellectual capability alone wasn't sufficient for success in intelligence analysis that dealt with threats to American security. Students were subjected to physical training, psychological evaluation, and stress testing designed to identify weaknesses that might compromise their effectiveness under operational conditions where hesitation or emotional breakdown could result in catastrophic failures to prevent terrorist attacks or other threats to civilian populations. The training environment deliberately created pressure situations that revealed character traits which might not appear under normal circumstances. Students were pushed beyond their comfort zones physically, intellectually, and emotionally to determine whether they possessed the resilience necessary for intelligence work that often involved processing information about terrorist attacks, war crimes, and threats to civilian populations that would disturb most people. Sergeant Major William Granite Stone commanded the training cadre at the farm, and his reputation for demanding perfection from students was legendary throughout the intelligence community. Stone had spent 23 years in military intelligence, including deployments to every major conflict zone where American forces had operated during the past 2 decades, from the Persian Gulf War through multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he'd been responsible for intelligence analysis that affected the safety of thousands of American personnel. His weathered face and quiet intensity suggested someone who'd seen enough classified information to understand exactly what kinds of threats America faced from enemies who would exploit any weakness they could identify in American security measures, personnel, or operational procedures. Stone had developed training methods based on real-world experience that eliminated candidates who possessed academic credentials but lacked the emotional resilience necessary for intelligence work under operational pressure. At 45, Stone represented the professional standards that the intelligence community hoped to maintain in its most critical positions. He developed assessment criteria and training methods that identified individuals capable of maintaining analytical objectivity while processing information that could emotionally devastate less prepared personnel. His training philosophy emphasized that intelligence analysts needed to maintain human empathy while avoiding emotional reactions that could compromise their professional judgment. "Listen up, people," Stone announced to the 60 new students assembled in the main briefing hall on their first morning at the farm. "You're here because someone thinks you have the intellectual capability to become intelligence analysts. Over the next 16 weeks, we're going to find out whether that assessment is correct and whether you possess the additional qualities necessary for success in this field." His voice carried the authority that came from years of experience making decisions that affected mission success and personnel safety in situations where errors in judgment could result in American casualties or successful enemy operations. The students facing him represented diverse backgrounds: military officers with combat experience, civilian academics with advanced degrees, recent college graduates who demonstrated exceptional analytical thinking during previous assignments, and experienced professionals seeking career transitions into intelligence work. Intelligence analysis isn't an academic exercise conducted in the safety of university libraries, Stone continued, his gaze moving across the assembled students with clinical assessment. You'll be processing information about real threats to real people, making assessments that determine whether families live or die, whether terrorist attacks succeed or fail, whether American forces walk into ambushes or avoid them based on your analysis of enemy capabilities and intentions. The briefing hall itself reflected the serious nature of their training mission. Maps covered the walls showing global hotspots where American intelligence personnel operated under dangerous conditions, while display screens showed real-time information feeds that provided constant updates on international security situations that required ongoing analysis and assessment by intelligence professionals working around the clock to protect American interests. "Your job will be to connect dots that other people can't see," Stone explained, activating a presentation that showed examples of intelligence analysis that had prevented terrorist attacks and military disasters. "You'll receive fragments of information from human intelligence sources, signals intelligence intercepts, imagery analysis, and open-source research. Your task is to determine what those fragments mean and whether they indicate threats that require immediate action. Rodriguez listened to his orientation with the focused attention that had characterized her academic performance, but she also felt growing anxiety about the challenges ahead that went beyond simple academic pressure. Her classmates included former military personnel with combat experience, CIA officers with years of field operations under dangerous conditions, and analysts who'd already proven themselves in high-pressure assignments where their work had directly affected national security decisions. The diversity of backgrounds represented in her class was both inspiring and intimidating. Some students had served in special operations units where they gathered intelligence under combat conditions, while others had worked in embassy security positions where they'd analyzed threats to American diplomatic personnel. Several had advanced degrees from institutions like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, while others brought practical experience from law enforcement, military intelligence, or corporate security positions. The physical training component began immediately after the academic orientation, with standards that seemed designed to eliminate candidates who couldn't handle stress that combined intellectual and physical demands simultaneously. Students were required to complete obstacle courses, endurance runs, and combat training exercises while maintaining the analytical thinking necessary for their primary mission of processing intelligence information under pressure. Rodriguez had maintained reasonable physical fitness during college through regular exercise and participation in intramural sports, but she'd never been subjected to military-style training that pushed participants beyond their comfort zones to determine their breaking points. The first week included daily runs that started at 5 miles and increased each day, obstacle courses that required upper body strength she'd never developed, and defensive tactics training that involved physical contact with instructors who showed no consideration for gender differences or previous experience levels. The training cadre made it clear that intelligence analysts might face physical danger during their careers, including assignments to combat zones, embassy security positions, or field operations where they could encounter hostile forces. Physical fitness and defensive tactics training were considered essential preparation for operational assignments where analysts might need to protect themselves or others while accomplishing their intelligence missions. Move, move, move. Stone shouted as students struggled through an obstacle course that combined climbing walls, crawling under barriers, and carrying heavy equipment across terrain designed to test endurance and determination. Intelligence analysts don't get to quit when things get difficult. Lives depend on your ability to function when you're tired, stressed, and operating beyond your comfort zone. The obstacle course was designed to simulate conditions that intelligence analysts might encounter during operational assignments. Physical exhaustion combined with mental pressure that required maintaining analytical thinking while the body was pushed to its limits. Students had to navigate the course while carrying equipment that represented the communication gear, computer systems, and defensive equipment they might need during field assignments. Rodriguez found herself falling behind classmates who had military backgrounds or superior physical conditioning that came from years of regular physical training. Her academic achievements meant nothing when she couldn't complete pull-ups, struggled with rope climbing exercises that required upper body strength she'd never developed, and finished endurance runs in the bottom quarter of her class despite her best efforts to keep pace with more physically prepared students. More concerning than her physical performance was her emotional response to the constant pressure and criticism from instructors who seemed determined to identify her weaknesses and push her beyond breaking points that would reveal character flaws incompatible with intelligence work. The training environment was deliberately designed to create stress that would expose personality traits that might compromise operational effectiveness under real-world conditions. By the end of the first week, she'd been reduced to tears twice during training exercises that pushed her beyond physical limits she'd never previously tested, while simultaneously demanding intellectual performance that required processing complex information under time constraints. The crying wasn't from physical pain. It was from frustration, exhaustion, and the growing fear that she might not possess the emotional resilience necessary for success in a program that represented her only opportunity for the career she'd dreamed of pursuing. The emotional reactions were particularly devastating because they occurred in front of classmates whose respect and acceptance she needed for success in training that emphasized teamwork and mutual support under pressure. Intelligence analysis often required collaborative effort where personnel had to trust each other's judgment and capabilities, making personal relationships and peer acceptance crucial for both training success and operational effectiveness. Look at her. She heard one of her classmates whisper during a break between training exercises when students were supposed to be resting and preparing for the next challenge. Crying again because she can't handle a little physical training. How is she going to react when she has to analyze real intelligence about terrorist attacks that killed innocent people? The comment came from Marcus Webb, a former Marine Corps intelligence officer who'd completed 2 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan before being selected for advanced training at the farm. Webb had distinguished himself during urban combat operations in Fallujah, earning decorations for actions that remained classified, but had clearly involved significant personal risk under dangerous conditions where intelligence gathering required physical courage as well as analytical capability. His military experience had taught him that emotional reactions under pressure often indicated character weaknesses that could compromise mission effectiveness when lives depended on maintaining professional composure under extreme stress. In his view, crying during training exercises suggested that Rodriguez might not possess the emotional stability necessary for intelligence work that routinely involved processing disturbing information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Maybe intelligence analysis isn't for everyone, added Sarah Chun, a CIA officer with 3 years of experience in counterterrorism operations that had taken her to dangerous assignments in multiple countries where American intelligence personnel operated under constant threat from hostile forces. This job requires emotional stability under pressure that goes way beyond what most people can handle, especially when you're processing intelligence about threats to civilian populations. Chin's assessment reflected genuine concerns about the psychological demands of intelligence work based on her operational experience, but it also revealed assumptions about Rodriguez's capabilities based on limited observation of her reactions to training stress. In Chin's experience, emotional responses to pressure often indicated weaknesses that would compromise analytical judgment under operational conditions where hesitation or emotional breakdown could result in failed missions. Rodriguez heard their comments and felt additional pressure beyond the already demanding training requirements that tested her limits daily. She was being evaluated not just on her analytical capabilities and physical performance, but on her emotional responses to stress that her classmates seemed to handle more easily based on their military backgrounds and previous exposure to high-pressure situations. But she'd made a commitment to herself that went beyond the opinions of her classmates or the assessment of her instructors, a commitment rooted in personal experience that had motivated her pursuit of intelligence analysis as a career field. She'd lost family members in the September 11th attacks, and she'd pursued intelligence analysis because she believed her language skills and cultural knowledge could contribute to preventing similar attacks that threatened innocent people who couldn't protect themselves from terrorist violence. The academic portion of the program proved to be equally demanding as the physical training, requiring students to process vast amounts of complex information while operating under time constraints that simulated operational conditions where intelligence analysts had to produce assessments quickly enough to support decision-making by military commanders and government officials. Intelligence analysis involved synthesizing data from multiple sources, identifying patterns that might indicate emerging threats, and making assessments that would guide policy decisions at the highest levels of government. Your job is to connect dots that other people can't see, Stone explained during their first major analytical exercise, which was designed to test students' ability to process information under pressure while maintaining the objectivity necessary for accurate assessment. You'll receive fragments of information from human intelligence sources, signals intelligence intercepts, imagery analysis, and open-source research. Your task is to determine what those fragments mean and whether they indicate threats that require immediate action. The exercise involved analyzing intelligence reports related to suspected terrorist activity in a fictional scenario that was based on real-world threats that American intelligence services had actually confronted during recent operations. Students had 6 hours to review hundreds of documents, identify significant patterns that might not be obvious to casual observation, and produce written assessments that would guide hypothetical military and diplomatic responses to the identified threats. Rodriguez approached the exercise with the methodical thinking that had characterized her academic work throughout college, applying analytical frameworks she'd learned during her international relations studies to the intelligence information she was processing. But she quickly discovered that intelligence analysis under time pressure was entirely different from academic research, with unlimited time for reflection, revision, and consultation with professors and fellow students. The volume of information was overwhelming, requiring rapid processing of technical intelligence reports, cultural analysis, psychological profiles, and operational assessments that demanded different types of analytical thinking simultaneously. The time constraints were severe, allowing no opportunity for the careful research and multiple drafts that characterized academic work. Most challenging was the pressure to produce accurate assessments with the knowledge that errors could have catastrophic consequences for American security and innocent civilian lives. Her first analytical product was returned with extensive criticism from instructors who identified weaknesses in her methodology, gaps in her analysis, and conclusions that weren't adequately supported by available evidence. The feedback was professionally delivered but personally devastating, suggesting that her academic achievements hadn't prepared her for the demands of operational intelligence analysis, where different standards and expectations applied. Rodriguez Stone called her aside after reviewing her work during a private conference that felt like an academic tribunal. "Your linguistic capabilities and cultural knowledge are exceptional, and your academic background provides valuable context for understanding the political and social factors that motivate terrorist organizations. However, your analytical methodology needs significant improvement before you'll be ready for operational assignments." It was a fair assessment that identified areas where she needed to improve while acknowledging her strengths, but it also represented additional pressure on someone who was already struggling with the combined demands of physical and academic training that tested her limits daily. Rodriguez felt herself becoming increasingly isolated from classmates who seemed more capable of handling stress that was testing her emotional resilience and professional confidence. The isolation was compounded by her emotional reactions to training pressure, which had earned her a reputation among classmates as someone who might not possess the psychological stability necessary for intelligence work. Her crying during physical training had been observed by everyone in her class, creating perceptions about her emotional strength that affected how others interacted with her during academic exercises and social activities. The breakthrough came during the fourth week of training, when students were subjected to a field exercise that combined physical endurance with analytical thinking under conditions designed to simulate operational stress that intelligence analysts might encounter during overseas assignments or emergency response situations. The exercise involved a 12-mile movement through terrain that tested navigation skills, physical conditioning, and the ability to process intelligence information while operating beyond normal comfort zones. The field exercise was conducted in a national forest that provided terrain similar to operational environments where American intelligence personnel might be required to work. Students had to navigate using map and compass while carrying equipment that simulated the communication gear and computer systems they might need during field assignments. Additionally, they were required to process intelligence reports and produce analytical assessments while moving through challenging terrain under time constraints. Rodriguez began the exercise knowing that her physical limitations would make the movement more difficult than for classmates with superior conditioning and military experience. But she developed strategies for managing her emotional responses to stress, and she was determined to complete the exercise regardless of the physical cost or the opinions of classmates who had questioned her emotional stability and physical capabilities. The exercise began before dawn with students receiving their initial intelligence briefing and navigation instructions under field conditions that simulated the operational security requirements that would apply during actual intelligence missions. They were organized into small teams that would move independently toward objective points where they would conduct analytical exercises before continuing to the final destination. 6 miles into the movement, as Rodriguez's team was crossing a particularly challenging section of terrain with steep slopes and loose rock that required careful navigation, Sergeant Major Stone collapsed with what appeared to be a serious ankle injury sustained when he stepped into a concealed depression while demonstrating proper movement techniques to students who were struggling with the terrain. The injury was real, not part of the training exercise, and it presented a situation that required immediate decision-making from students who suddenly found themselves responsible for their instructor's safety in a remote location where medical evacuation would be complicated by terrain and distance from roads where ambulances could provide access. "My ankle's broken," Stone announced through gritted teeth as he assessed his injury while trying to maintain the professional composure that he demanded from his students. "I can't put weight on it, and we're still 6 miles from the extraction point. Someone needs to call for medical evacuation while others figure out how to get me to a location where helicopters can land." The students gathered around their injured instructor, processing a situation that wasn't covered in their training manuals or standard operating procedures. They were dealing with a real emergency that required leadership, medical assessment, and decision-making under pressure that would test everything they'd learned about functioning under stress while maintaining analytical thinking. Medical evacuation would require radio communication that might not be possible from their current location due to terrain features that blocked signals, and moving Stone to a position where helicopters could land would require carrying him across terrain that had challenged them even without additional weight. Additionally, they had to continue their intelligence analysis exercise while managing the emergency, simulating operational conditions where analysts might face multiple simultaneous challenges. "I'll call for medical evacuation," Webb announced, taking charge with the confidence that came from combat experience where he'd dealt with wounded personnel under hostile conditions. "Chun, you help me get the sergeant major to higher ground, where we can establish radio contact with base operations." It was a reasonable plan that reflected conventional military thinking about casualty evacuation procedures. But Rodriguez had noticed something that others had missed while they focused on immediate action rather than analytical assessment of the situation. Their current position was in a valley where radio communication would be blocked by surrounding terrain features, and moving Stone to higher ground would require carrying him up a steep slope that would be extremely difficult and potentially dangerous for someone with a serious ankle injury. "Wait," Rodriguez interjected, her voice carrying the analytical certainty that came from processing multiple variables while others focused on single solutions. "We can't carry him up that slope without making his injury worse, and even if we reach higher ground for radio contact, medical evacuation will take at least an hour to coordinate and execute. He needs immediate treatment, and we need to get him to the extraction point ourselves." Her classmates looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to annoyance, their attention focused on managing the emergency rather than considering alternative approaches that might not fit conventional thinking. They were dealing with a serious situation that required leadership from someone with experience in emergency medical situations, not analytical input from someone who'd been struggling with the physical demands of training and emotional responses to pressure. "Rodriguez, this isn't the time for academic theorizing," Webb replied with barely concealed irritation that reflected his frustration with the emergency situation and his assessment of her qualifications to contribute to solution development. "Sergeant Major Stone needs professional medical attention, not amateur medical assessment from someone who's been crying her way through training." The comment stung, but Rodriguez had made her decision based on analysis that went beyond emotional reactions to immediate circumstances. She'd studied the terrain during their movement, calculated the time required for medical evacuation based on their location and available resources, and assessed Stone's condition based on medical training she'd received, but never mentioned to her classmates because it hadn't seemed relevant to intelligence analysis training. "I'm not theorizing," she replied calmly, her voice carrying conviction that surprised classmates who had primarily seen her emotional reactions to training pressure. "I'm a certified emergency medical technician with 3 years of experience working ambulance service before college. The sergeant major has a compound fracture that's causing internal bleeding. If we wait for evacuation, he could go into shock and die before medical help arrives." Her revelation stunned the other students, who had no knowledge of her medical background or the practical experience that had motivated her academic studies and career choices. Emergency medical technician certification required extensive training and practical experience that few college students pursued, especially those focused on academic achievement rather than practical skills that prepared them for emergency situations. Additionally, Rodriguez continued, her analytical training taking over from emotional responses as she processed the emergency situation, I've calculated our movement options based on terrain analysis and time factors. If we make a stretcher using available materials and carry him to the extraction point, we can get him to medical attention 40 minutes faster than waiting for evacuation here. She was already moving toward materials that could be used to construct a field-expedient stretcher, her medical training taking over from analytical thinking as she processed the emergency situation with the professional competence that came from experience managing medical emergencies under pressure. Her classmates watched in growing amazement as she demonstrated practical skills that none of them had suspected she possessed. "Webb, I need your jacket and chins," she instructed with the authority that came from medical training and emergency experience. "We'll use them with these tree branches to make a stretcher that can support the sergeant major's weight. Mason, you're the strongest. You'll take the front position. I'll take the back and navigate while monitoring the sergeant major's condition." For the next 3 hours, Rodriguez led her classmates in carrying their injured instructor across 6 miles of challenging terrain while providing continuous medical assessment and treatment that prevented complications from developing. Her medical knowledge proved crucial in monitoring Stone's condition and making adjustments to their movement that prevented his injury from becoming life-threatening. Her leadership during the emergency transformed her classmates' perception of her capabilities and emotional stability. The same sensitivity that had made her cry during physical training had also motivated her to pursue medical training that proved crucial in saving their instructor's life. Her analytical thinking, rather than being compromised by emotion, had been enhanced by empathy that helped her process human factors that others missed. They reached the extraction point 47 minutes before medical evacuation could have reached their original position, providing Stone with professional medical attention that prevented complications from developing into life-threatening conditions. Her analysis of time factors and movement options had been correct, demonstrating the same analytical capability under pressure that intelligence work required. "Rodriguez," Stone said as medical personnel loaded him into an ambulance. "That was exceptional emergency medical care and outstanding leadership under pressure. You saved my life today, and you did it while demonstrating exactly the kind of analytical thinking and decision-making we're trying to develop in intelligence analysts." Her classmates looked at her with new respect, finally understanding that her emotional responses to training stress didn't reflect weakness, but rather sensitivity that enhanced her ability to process human factors in analytical situations. The same empathy that had made her cry during physical training had also motivated her to pursue medical training that proved crucial in an emergency. Over the remaining 12 weeks of training, Rodriguez's classmates discovered that her emotional sensitivity was actually an analytical advantage in intelligence work that required understanding human motivations, psychological factors, and cultural dynamics that affected terrorist recruitment, operational planning, and target selection. Her ability to process emotional content without becoming detached from its human implications made her particularly effective at analyzing threats that involved civilian populations. Her final analytical project involved assessing intelligence related to a potential terrorist attack on a major American city, a scenario based on actual threat information that had been processed by American intelligence services. While other students focused on technical capabilities and logistical requirements, Rodriguez identified psychological patterns in the intelligence that suggested the attack was imminent rather than being in early planning stages. The language patterns in these intercepts show increasing emotional intensity and references to martyrdom that indicate final preparation phases, she explained during her presentation to instructors and classmates. "This isn't planning. This is execution preparation happening right now." The psychological indicators suggest the operatives are mentally preparing for immediate action. Her assessment proved correct when federal authorities arrested the terrorist cell 48 hours later, preventing an attack that could have killed thousands of civilians in a major metropolitan area. The arrest was based primarily on Rodriguez's analysis of psychological indicators that other analysts had dismissed as insignificant background noise in communication intercepts. Following graduation from the farm with distinction as the top analytical performer in her class, Rodriguez was assigned to the National Counterterrorism Center, where her unique combination of linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and emotional intelligence made her one of the most effective analysts in the organization. Her ability to identify human factors in intelligence made her particularly valuable for preventing attacks that threatened civilian populations. Years later, when new students arrived at the farm and struggled with the emotional demands of intelligence training, instructors would tell them about Elena Rodriguez, the analyst who cried during physical training but whose empathy and determination prevented a national tragedy through superior analytical work. Her story became part of training lore, illustrating that emotional sensitivity could be a professional strength rather than a weakness when properly channeled into analytical thinking. The success of Rodriguez's terrorist threat analysis became a watershed moment in intelligence training methodology at the farm. Her case demonstrated that traditional assumptions about emotional resilience in intelligence work needed to be reconsidered based on operational results rather than theoretical models of psychological strength. The intelligence community began to understand that empathy and emotional sensitivity, when properly channeled, could enhance analytical capability rather than compromise it. 6 months after her graduation, Rodriguez was called back to the farm to address a new class of intelligence analyst candidates who were struggling with the same challenges she had faced. Standing in the same briefing hall where she had first heard Sergeant Major Stone's orientation, she looked out at 60 new faces that reflected the same mixture of determination and anxiety she remembered from her own first day. "When I started this program," she began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proven performance under operational conditions, "I was told that crying during training meant I was too weak for intelligence work. Today, I want to tell you about the difference between emotional weakness and emotional strength, and why understanding that difference might save American lives." The new students listened with the same focused attention she had given to Stone's briefing, but their expressions showed recognition that they were hearing from someone who had faced the same challenges they were confronting. Her presence as a successful graduate who had overcome initial struggles provided hope for students who were questioning their own capabilities. Intelligence analysis isn't about being tough enough to ignore human suffering, Rodriguez continued, echoing words that Stone had spoken to her during her own training. It's about being strong enough to process that suffering and use it to prevent more suffering from occurring. The best analysts are those who never lose sight of the human stakes involved in their work. She spent the next hour describing her analytical methodology, emphasizing how emotional understanding of human motivations had enhanced her ability to identify patterns in terrorist communications that others had missed. Her approach to intelligence analysis had evolved to incorporate psychological insights that came from maintaining emotional connection to the human consequences of analytical failures. "The night before I identified the terrorist cell that was planning an attack on American civilians," Rodriguez explained, "I wasn't thinking about career advancement or professional recognition. I was thinking about families who would never come home if I missed something in the intelligence. That emotional connection to human stakes made me more careful, more thorough, and more willing to challenge conventional analytical approaches." Her methodology had become a model for training future analysts who needed to balance emotional engagement with analytical objectivity. The intelligence community had learned that complete emotional detachment often led to analytical blindness that missed human factors crucial for understanding terrorist motivations and operational planning. Following her presentation to the new class, Rodriguez was assigned to develop new training curricula that incorporated emotional intelligence training into analytical methodology. Her work influenced intelligence training programs throughout the government, changing how analysts were prepared for operational assignments that required understanding human psychological factors. The psychological evaluation component of intelligence training was revised to identify candidates who could maintain emotional engagement while avoiding emotional breakdown under operational pressure. Rather than selecting only those who showed complete emotional detachment, evaluators began looking for individuals who could process emotional content without losing analytical objectivity. Rodriguez's influence extended beyond training methodology to operational procedures used by intelligence analysts working on active cases. Her approach to psychological pattern analysis became standard practice for counterterrorism teams evaluating threat information that involved potential attacks on civilian targets. Analysts were trained to look for emotional indicators in terrorist communications that revealed operational timelines and psychological preparation phases. The terrorist cell she had identified through psychological analysis became a case study used throughout the intelligence community to illustrate the importance of human factors in threat assessment. The case demonstrated how traditional technical analysis had missed crucial indicators that were only visible when analysts understood the psychological and emotional dimensions of terrorist operational planning. 5 years after her graduation from the farm, Rodriguez was promoted to senior analyst and assigned to lead a counter-terrorism team responsible for preventing attacks on American civilian targets. Her team specialized in psychological analysis of terrorist communications, using emotional intelligence techniques she had developed to identify threats that traditional analytical methods missed. Her team's success rate in identifying and preventing terrorist attacks exceeded that of any other analytical unit in the intelligence community, with a track record that included preventing 12 major attacks and disrupting dozens of smaller operations that could have resulted in significant civilian casualties. Their success was attributed to analytical methods that incorporated emotional understanding of terrorist psychology and motivational factors. The leadership style Rodriguez developed emphasized the importance of maintaining emotional connection to mission stakes while supporting team members who might struggle with the psychological demands of intelligence work. She created training programs that taught analysts how to process disturbing information without becoming emotionally overwhelmed, while maintaining the empathy necessary for understanding human motivational factors. "We're not just processing data," she would tell new team members during their orientation. "We're trying to understand human beings who have chosen to dedicate their lives to killing innocent people. Understanding their psychology requires emotional intelligence that goes beyond technical analytical skills." Her team's analytical products were sought after by policymakers throughout the government because they provided insights into terrorist psychology and operational planning that informed strategic decisions about counterterrorism policy and resource allocation. Rodriguez's analytical approach had proven that emotional intelligence could enhance rather than compromise analytical capability when properly applied. The training incident where she had cried during physical exercises became part of intelligence community lore, but the story evolved to emphasize how emotional sensitivity had been transformed into analytical strength rather than overcome as a weakness. New analysts learned that emotional responses to training pressure could indicate empathy that would enhance their analytical capability if properly channeled. Sergeant Major Stone, who had recovered completely from his ankle injury, became one of Rodriguez's strongest advocates within the training community. He frequently cited her case when discussing the evolution of intelligence training methodology and the importance of identifying and developing different types of analytical capability rather than applying uniform standards that might exclude valuable talent. "Rodriguez taught us that strength comes in many forms," Stone would tell new instructor candidates. "Our job isn't to eliminate emotional responses to difficult material. It's to help analysts channel those responses into better analytical products that save American lives." The medical emergency during field training became a standard scenario used to evaluate students' ability to function under pressure while maintaining analytical thinking. Rodriguez's leadership during the emergency was used as an example of how analytical training could be applied to real-world problem-solving that went beyond intelligence analysis to include emergency response and leadership under crisis conditions. Her emergency medical background, which had initially seemed irrelevant to intelligence analysis, became recognized as an example of how diverse experiences could enhance analytical capability. The intelligence community began actively recruiting candidates with varied backgrounds that included medical training, emergency response experience, and other practical skills that could contribute to analytical capability. The stretcher improvisation and emergency medical care Rodriguez had provided during the training exercise became part of survival training curricula taught to intelligence analysts who might be assigned to dangerous overseas locations. Her demonstration that analytical thinking could be applied to emergency situations illustrated the broader applications of intelligence training beyond traditional analytical tasks. Years later, when Rodriguez was promoted to lead the National Counterterrorism Center's Psychological Analysis Division, she established training programs that emphasized the importance of emotional intelligence in threat assessment. Her division became responsible for analyzing psychological factors in terrorist recruitment, operational planning, and target selection that affected American security interests worldwide. The analytical methodology she developed was adopted by intelligence services of allied nations who recognized the effectiveness of psychological analysis in preventing terrorist attacks. Rodriguez's approach to emotional intelligence in intelligence analysis became a model for international cooperation in counterterrorism operations that required understanding human motivational factors across cultural boundaries. Her career trajectory from a student who cried during training to a senior intelligence official responsible for preventing terrorist attacks demonstrated that emotional sensitivity could be transformed into professional capability when properly developed and channeled. Her story inspired countless other intelligence professionals who had struggled with similar challenges during their training and early careers. The personal cost of her success was something Rodriguez rarely discussed publicly, but those who worked closely with her understood that maintaining emotional connection to human stakes while processing information about terrorist threats required constant psychological maintenance and support systems that helped prevent emotional burnout and secondary trauma from exposure to disturbing material. She developed support programs for intelligence analysts that addressed the psychological challenges of processing information about human suffering while maintaining analytical objectivity. These programs became standard practice throughout the intelligence community, recognizing that emotional support was necessary for maintaining analytical capability over long careers in counterterrorism work. The terrorist attack that Rodriguez's analysis had prevented would have killed over 3,000 civilians in a coordinated bombing campaign targeting major American cities. The psychological analysis that identified the operational timeline had been based on emotional indicators in terrorist communications that traditional technical analysis had categorized as insignificant background information. Her analytical report on the prevented attack became required reading for intelligence analysts throughout the government, illustrating how psychological pattern analysis could reveal operational information that technical analysis missed. The case demonstrated that emotional intelligence was not just a supplementary analytical tool, but an essential capability for understanding human threats to American security. 20 years after her graduation from the farm, Rodriguez was appointed to serve as the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, becoming the highest-ranking intelligence official to have overcome initial training struggles through emotional sensitivity transformed into analytical strength. Her appointment represented recognition that the intelligence community's most challenging threats required leaders who understood human psychological factors as well as technical capabilities. In her confirmation hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee, Rodriguez reflected on her journey from a student who had been mocked for crying during training to a senior intelligence official responsible for protecting American national security interests worldwide. "The tears I shed during training weren't signs of weakness," she testified. "They were evidence of emotional engagement with human stakes that would later enable me to identify threats that others missed because they had learned to ignore human factors in analytical work." Her confirmation was unanimous, with senators from both parties recognizing that her analytical capability and leadership experience represented exactly the kind of emotional intelligence and human understanding that American intelligence services needed to address evolving threats in an increasingly complex global security environment. The intelligence training programs Rodriguez had influenced continued to produce analysts who combined technical analytical skills with emotional intelligence that enhanced their ability to understand human threats. Her legacy in intelligence training emphasized that analytical capability was enhanced rather than compromised by maintaining emotional connection to mission stakes and human consequences of analytical failures. Because sometimes the person who saves everyone is the one who never stops feeling the weight of what failure would mean. And sometimes tears aren't signs of weakness. They're proof that someone cares enough to carry the burden that others can't even see. The girl who cried during training became the woman who prevented national tragedies through analytical work that saved thousands of American lives, proving that emotional strength and analytical capability could be perfectly combined in service to protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm.